I'd like to welcome Professor Duncan Petrie from the University of York, who's going to talk about this subject, which is a hot potato at UWE and possibly even at the University of Bristol. I don't know. We're going to find out. But Duncan has, well, I shall tell you some things. So Duncan graduated from the University of Edinburgh.
A long time ago.
A long time ago, even though he accused me of being much, much older. Mine is Terry Faxton, by the way, for those of you that don't know. So his 1990 PhD thesis was entitled Making Movies, the Structuring of Creativity in Contemporary British Cinema. He then worked as a research officer at the British Film Institute in 95 for...
From 90 to 95.
90 to 95.
Yeah.
Followed by years in the School of English at the University of Exeter, where he established and directed the Bill Douglas Centre for the History of Cinema and Popular Culture. In 2004 he moved to the University of Auckland in New Zealand as Professor of Film and Head of Department of Film, Television Media Studies. And in January 2009 he joined the University of York, where he's currently the Department's Director of Research and Head of Film and Television Studies. He's written a lot of books, so I'm not going to read all those out. I'd actually like to get to the nub of what we're here for. Maybe we'll talk about those in a while. But his current research is on the history of film schools and their contribution to the development of the art and craft of filmmaking. And this work will be published in a monograph co-authored by Rod Stoneman, who's an ex-assistant commissioning editor of the Independent Department at Channel 4 during 85
about 85 to about 93 he was there.
93.
Yeah.
And it's entitled Cultivating Filmmakers, the Past, Present and Future of Film Schools. He's currently a member of the Peer Review College for the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Are you ready?
I'm fine, yeah, ready to go. Okay, well first of all, welcome. I'm very pleased to be the first speaker in, I think, what will be a very interesting series, certainly given the plans that that Terry has for the unit. Now, as he's told you already, what I want to talk about today really is coming out of the project I've been working on for the past 4 or 5 years, when I've not been kind of setting up the new Department of Theatre, Film and Television at the University of York, with my colleagues, I hasten to add. This project really is looking at the history and the contribution of film schools to the development of film and television as media, the development of particular industries, and I guess also the sort of trying to chart changes in the way in which the pedagogy and the practice of the formation, education and training of film and TV professionals has kind of developed over, well, what's actually now nearly 100 years. And this emerged really out of a kind of a dissatisfaction that I felt with the sort of predominant skills training approach, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. That it seemed to me that we had a very instrumentalized, a very reductive approach to how we were thinking about what the formation of film and TV professionals was. And I'm really talking here about, you know, people whose ambitions were to go into the mainstream industries. I'm not kind of trying to make a separation between, if you like, a world of independent practice and then a world of mainstream practice. I'm actually talking about how we train folk in what we tend to think of as film schools. I think, I mean, the origins of this project do relate to some of the experience that Terry's alluded to. My time at the University of Auckland in particular, because the department that I was running there, Film, Television and Media Studies, was quite a well-established department in New Zealand. It had very good relations with the industry, because outside Peter Jackson and the New Zealand Film Commission, both of which are sort of, located in Wellington. Auckland is basically the centre of film and television in New Zealand. So my department, which had a production masters, had really kind of built up quite a productive and you know, quite an exciting relationship with the industry. But running this department kind of immediately brought me into, you know, a sort of situation of having to work through some of the more difficult aspects of, well, on one hand, the relationship between theory and practice, which of course is that old chestnut that we continually debate and continually sort of identify as a problem, but still seems to be sort of stubbornly with us. But the other thing was actually the relationship between you know, a university and industry organisations. This all came to a head when our department went through an accreditation process, not unlike the skill set process here, when we were visited by a panel of people who all apparently seemed like it'd been a long time since any of them had actually worked in the industries that they were, you know, purporting to represent. And it was a very unsatisfying experience, I have to say. And so when I came back to the UK and discovered that, if anything, it was even more writ large in Britain because of the way in which the skill set agenda had been advanced, I kind of knew this was something that really I needed to think more about. Obviously, one of the things that sits behind that, well, those developments, I think, are the way in which, well, what I'm calling here a creative industries policy approach has kind of come to guide so much to do with the way in which, if you like, the paymasters and certain aspects of the industry have kind of attempted to, if you like, influence the way in which education and training of practitioners developed. So if we move to the situation in Britain, funnily enough, this was all starting to happen just as I was going out to New Zealand. In 2003, Skillset, in collaboration with the now defunct UK Film Council, published their strategy, A Bigger Future, which was basically a strategy for the transformation of training policy in Britain. And this document set out a number of problems that they perceived with the current situation and how they were going to go about sort of solving those problems. One of the things it did identify as a major problem was a disconnect between what higher education institutions were doing, what they were providing, and what the industry apparently wanted. And a way to fix this, according to this strategy, was to bring in a kind of wholesale system of course validations. And of course, it was the beginning of also the academies program, the emergence of a number of skill set approved academies. Initially, there were two different kinds, as I'm sure you're aware, screen academies and media academies. We now have a small number of film academies, and I'm trying to think if the Media Academies program is still actually with us in its old form. I'm not entirely sure if it is, but the issue here was that, in a sense, Skillset were setting out to, if you like, impose a certain vision and a certain set of structures and processes on higher education. One of the things that immediately struck me when I read the document was the way in which they talked about higher education. I mean, basically, universities and colleges were talked about as training providers, which immediately suggests a very, very specific, and to my mind, certainly diminished role in terms of what I thought we were supposed to be about. And of course, we were training providers to serve the needs of the industry. This wasn't a dialogue, this wasn't a partnership. This is a one-way process where, at its absolute crudest, training providers were there to sort of create pegs to fit into predetermined holes. Now, another thing that struck me reading this document was there was absolutely no sense of the value of independent ideas or critical understandings, and there was no notion that film education and training specifically for industry had a long history. I mean, in fact, as you'll see, the first film school was set up in Moscow in 1919. There was no reference whatsoever to this history. So the idea that somehow you could learn something from that, even if it were to effectively say, this is now no longer appropriate to our needs, but it was just ignored. And it struck me actually as being a classic example of, and I hate to talk about New Labour because of course, we're now 4 years kind of, struggling under the cosh of the Tory-led coalition, but do cast your minds back. New Labour might have pumped more money into various, parts of the public sector, which we all kind of are grateful for, but it also had an extraordinary year zero approach to certain matters, including cultural ones. And this seemed to me that, just as New Labour was all about forgetting old Labour and anything that had kind of smacked of previous ways of doing things, so too this approach. And it seemed to me, as someone who was interested in history and interested in institutions and interested in the way in which kind of ideas had sort of, developed and changed, that there was a big hole here. So this gave me the sense of, a project really. And of course, having moved to the University of York, which was a brand new department, which had, for some incredible stroke of luck as far as I was concerned, had, this university that didn't have a track record in this kind of area, had, managed to raise 30 million quid to set up a new department, which was going to be very industry focused, very practice oriented. That if I was going to go into a department like this and play, a key role of some sort, that I really needed to go and look into this kind of problem a little bit more. So, I've been kind of doing this research while at the same time sort of helping to develop and build up this new, very practice-oriented department. So, at one level, theory and practice is what I'm having to kind of negotiate all the time. So, getting into the history of film schools, which I thought, well, let's look at what happened in the past and see what lessons we might be able to learn for the present and the future. The first thing to say is that the kinds of film schools that I ended up looking at really fall into two different types. One is the European model, which was basically the model of the National Conservatoire, set up by the state, sometimes in partnership with industry, to create, an elite institution that would directly feed into and nurture a national film industry, a national moving image industry. The other model was the one that emerged in the United States, which was basically the university model, which was a university department or school, very much independent of the mainstream industry. And as I discovered, despite the fact that the first significant American film school was set up at the University of Southern California in 1932, it really wasn't until that movie brat generation of the late 60s, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Francis Coppola, that you really started to get a meaningful relationship between American film schools and Hollywood actually developing. So there was a big gap between, if you like, the aspiration and the reality coming to fruition. In terms of the European history, there are really three periods here. The initial interwar period, where we see the first film schools emerging in the Soviet Union, Italy and France. There's then a big sort of splurge of activity that happens immediately after the end of the Second World War. This is particularly marked in the new communist states of Eastern Europe. And then there's a second wave of European national film schools, which focuses much more on the West, and that kind of comes through in the 1960s. In America, the periodization is slightly different. The interwar period is actually a point when things again kick off. Post-World War II, we actually see quite a growth in university departments that are teaching practice, but actually there's a whole range of different applications here. And in fact, the thing that led to, if you like, the growth of film production in university campuses was actually the setting up of audiovisual units. And if you look at, you know, who the real movers and shakers were for a long time, they were kind of people running often units rather than, you know, servicing university as a whole, rather than, if you like, departments of film and television, what have you. Although I have to say a number of those departments were starting to be set up too. And it's really the 60s you get the breakthrough, and there are 5, if you like, top flight institutions that have really established themselves by the end of the 60s. You've got USC, UCLA, who basically set up a School of Theatre Arts in 1947. NYU, which was teaching television, funnily enough, in the 1950s quite successfully, and then branched out more into film come the 60s. And by 1965, when a new School of Arts was set up, which is now the Tisch School, it was now starting to make an important kind of mark for itself. Around the same time, you got a similar development at Columbia. And then the AFI, the American Film Institute, was established in 1967, and one of the key elements of the institute, and it was in Los Angeles as well, was a Center for Advanced Film Studies, which was basically a production conservatoire set up really on the European model. So, those were the sort of the major kind of developments. Just a little bit more detail here, so you can see when some of the European film schools were set up. So in 1919, the Soviet Union, of course, this is part and parcel of you know, the post-revolutionary fervor. Film, Lenin basically made his decree in 1919 that of all the arts, film was the most important. And, you know, as the industry was being nationalized, so too an institution was going to be an important part of that. Benito Mussolini was the next one to follow suit in 1935 for very similar reasons. Mussolini's brand of fascism was very cinematic. And among the things he did was to set up, you know, Cinecittà Studios, and across the road from Cinecittà Studios, the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia. So part and parcel again of a top-down, you know, national kind of program to develop a film industry, largely for propagandistic reasons. 1943, that'll be an interesting date if you think about it. Occupation time, that's when the French film school EDEC was set up. It was actually set up under the Nazi occupation. Not by the Nazis, it was set up by a bunch of committed cinephiles, led by Marcel L'Herbier. I'm going to say a little bit more about them in a wee bit, but we then get into that post-war period, and you can see Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Spain, obviously Franco's Spain. So, you know, the majority of these countries we're actually talking about are, you know, one-party states, pretty much. I didn't have enough space on one page to kind of get them all in. So here's how we're continuing. So we can see it's sort of slowing down a bit. And then the focus moves to the west. Germany is interesting because it's federated West Germany. You don't have a national school as such, but the two most important ones that were set up were the schools in West Berlin and in Munich. Munich being a more industrial-focused institution than the West Berlin one, which was far more kind of politically radical and experimental. And of course, good old Britain, part of Europe, is late in the day, 1970, before we finally have a national film television school in Britain. Although, as some of you will know, what is now called the London Film School dates back to 1957, when the London School of Film Technique was established in a little building above a grocer's shop in Electric Avenue in Brixton. So we did have a kind of, what was a sort of an aspiration for a national film school. But finally, after the Lloyd Commission, which was set up in 1965 by Jenny Lee, Harold Wilson's arts minister, reported 2 years later in 1967, but it took another 3 years before the National Film School was finally set up at Beaconsfield Studios. So yeah, we were slow compared to most of our continental neighbours. Now, I mentioned before that the first organisation to be set up was in Moscow. Now, what's interesting about the development of what became became the Higher State Institute of Cinematography in Moscow is that right from the get-go, the intellectual dimension of the training of personnel for this putative Soviet film industry was absolutely crucial. The first head of the organisation, can you see that wee red dot? This guy here is Vladimir Gardin, who was actually a theatre specialist, who came in and set up the school really along the basis of an arts conservatoire, based on the theatre conservatoire that existed. It didn't have much money to start with. This was the period, the immediate post-revolutionary period of the Civil War. So resources were really scarce, and in fact one of the things that they had to develop there was how to make films without film, which is one of the reasons why montage developed, because one way they did it was to kind of have a stage that they actually sort of broke down into different sections, so you could basically have things being played out that if you actually had film, they'd be happening kind of, sequentially, but they had to happen in a sort of stage format. But it immediately got people thinking about, the juxtaposition of different kind of elements in space and time. But of course, also, this guy here, some of you may recognize, Lev Kuleshov. Kuleshov's famous workshop, where he developed, among other things, the Kuleshov effect, was all part of the developing State Institute of Cinematography. Sergei Eisenstein, who attended some of Kuleshov's workshops, by the time he'd become a superstar, gone off around the world, met people like Walt Disney, went and tried to make a film in Mexico, of course, came back and discovered that the wind was changing and he was no longer flavour of the month. He ended up spending most of the 30s teaching directing at the State Institute, and it was during that period that he basically wrote most of his most crucial, important, influential essays on film form. And in fact developed the most extraordinary 5-year curriculum for directing, which I don't know if it ever actually was put into practice, but it's published as part of that collection of his works that the BFI put out in various volumes. It's in one of those volumes, and it's an absolute joy. It's basically it's Renaissance person's guide to being, the quintessential artist, where you basically are doing everything. That to be a director meant you had to be versed in literature, philosophy, painting, I think probably a bit of science and maths as well. I mean, if you think about the kind of polymath that Eisenstein was, this is totally reflected in his curriculum. But it tells you a lot about the kind of organisation that the geek was aspiring to be. In the early 30s, a film library was set up, a cinematheque was established. So what you had here was not just a training institute, but also an institution where the serious study of film and film history and film form could be engaged in. So, any of us who are film academics owe a great deal to the seeds that were sown in this organisation. Similarly, actually, the Centro Sperimentale, it may have been set up under fascism, but it was a relatively intellectually open place. The first head of the Centro, this guy here, Luigi Chiarini, was a critic, an intellectual. After the war, he was succeeded by Umberto Bombaro, who was a left-wing intellectual. And interesting enough, even during the 30s, before the fall of Mussolini, the Centro was basically a place where students were being exposed to a much wider range of sort of film art than the general public. So it's possible to see works that were kind of banned elsewhere. And the seeds of what was to become neorealism after the war were very much sown within the Centro during the 1930s. It also got involved in other kinds of cultural activities, had its own library, had its own publishing activities. The journal Bianco e Nero was published by the Centro. So again, that wider kind of participation in film study, film culture, was an absolutely crucial part of what the organisation was about. EDEC, as I said, set up under the occupation. Marcel L'Herbier, the avant-garde filmmaker and intellectual, was the first head. He was acceptable enough to the occupying authorities, I think mainly because he was largely apolitical. Some people have, in that kind of classic J'accuse French way, sort of suggested that he was a tad anti-Semitic and actually, fitted in rather well with the prevailing ideology of the rulers of that bit of France at the time. But I think in the end, frankly, it just came down to that he wasn't seen as any kind of threat. But again, after the liberation, EDEC developed quickly, brought a number of people on board to teach there, including people like Georges Sadoul, the great French film historian, Jean Mitry, the theorist. You had, again, research and scholarship going hand in hand with the training of production. One of the things that the Institute produced a lot of were fiches on various kind of aspects of film history. So again, you were getting a kind of, I suppose what we'd see is a sort of a proto-university department, really, sort of developing here too. It's also interesting to note that the emphasis, certainly through into the 50s at the school when it came to the training of practitioners, was very much on the creative team. That was kind of challenged quite significantly when the young firebrands of Cahiers de Cinema started to take a pop at the cinéma du papa, the cinema of quality, started to advocate the importance of the auteur, because of course the auteur created or helped to create a cinema whereby, the vision of the director meant everything, and the idea of the creative team was sort of, pushed to one side, despite the reality that even, Godard's early films would have been only half the films they are had Raoul Coutard not been behind the camera, for example. Just one, obvious example. So the idea of creative collaboration, very, very important. But, just another good example of the kind of integration, if you like, of theory and practice that was just, bread and butter of this organisation. And this is also, what happens in Eastern Europe after the war. It's kind of, you think about some of the people who were kind of crucial to these developments. Béla Balázs, the great Hungarian intellectual, screenwriter, critic. Balázs, when he was in exile, among other places, he spent some of it in Moscow. He taught at Vegik. In 1945, after the war, he returned to Hungary, and he was instrumental in setting up the Hungarian Film School. He didn't survive it very long. He fell out of favour with the powers that be, which took a very kind of hardline Stalinist approach to things. But his inspiration was right there at the start. In Poland, the key person was this guy, Jerzy Toplitz. Now, Jerzy Toplitz, as I discovered from my research, I'd never heard of him before, but Toplitz is probably one of the giants of film school education. He was probably more instrumental than anyone in the development of the reputation of Łódź, the Polish film school, as a centre of kind of artistic excellence, but also of kind of a free exchange of ideas. And you know, he was basically the inspiration behind the generation that became the Polish school. You know, that generation led by people like Wajda and Monk, and then the young Polanski and others. So he was absolutely crucial to what happened in Poland. And Otakar Wawra was the Czech, the key figure in the Czech school, FAMU, which again was to play an absolutely crucial role in being the, if you like, the sort of the seedbed for what became the Czech New Wave. So these were the kinds of people that were the leading lights, people who were very much intellectuals as well as, you know, kind of people with strong connections to the industry. Now, Toplitz, this just gives you a sense of kind of Toplitz's vision of film education. And elsewhere, he talked about film being a new art for a new society. And of course, you know, remember what we're talking about here. Eastern Europe after the Second World War, that interesting sort of coexistence of idealism alongside the difficulties, obviously, that any kind of genuine intellectual had labouring under, you know, the Stalinist period. But obviously you get kind of shifts, and you get moments where there's greater freedom for practitioners, artists, intellectuals to kind of do their thing. Of course, that then usually is followed by a sort of clampdown period. But certainly when Toplitz was able to kind of function, he kind of was really setting himself the task of what we've got here, of creating film artists whose whole approach was kind of rooted in a deep understanding of the past. I think this quote's great about the idea that what a filmmaker's got to do is to be immersed in the development of culture, address this, to basically engage with the world in a way to try and make that world better. Now, that might seem kind of terribly utopian or idealistic, but I do think it's kind of worth remembering that these were the sorts of sentiments that were guiding institutions like the Łódź Film School. And in fact, the development, I think, of Eastern European cinema in its most exciting phases really comes about through the roles played by, on one hand, the Łódź Film School here, and on the other hand, FAMU in Prague, because we have basically in these nationalized industries a single institution where different generations of practitioners are coming together, because of course that model, if you like, of established filmmakers coming back to teach the next generation is precisely how these institutions operated. Also, as I said earlier in relation to fascist Italy in the 1930s, communist Poland and communist Czechoslovakia in the post-war period, there was a greater kind of freedom to view work from across the world within the confines of these film schools than there was in the population at large. So they were privileged institutions, they were more enlightened, there were kind of places where ideas could be exchanged in a much more sort of free way than in the population at large. And so that's why you get the emergence of the Polish school in the 1950s, you get the emergence of the Czech New Wave in the 1960s. But of course, it's never a kind of constant, and it's never, you know, you can't apply, you know, a Whiggish theory of history to what's going on here, because it really does go like this. And you get, this is the very young Roman Polanski as he appears in his film Two Men in a Wardrobe, which was actually made under the auspices of the Polish Film School. It was the film that basically kind of brought him to the attention of the world. But he found himself very quickly feeling restricted under the system there, and within a few years he'd basically fled Poland and went into exile, initially in Paris, then in London. So it was always a difficult kind of situation when the authorities decided to clamp down. On the other hand, what you've got here are national film schools as the handmaiden for important film movements. Again, something that's worth remembering, that it's not that long ago that that's what a film school was setting out to actually do. In Britain, there was a similar attempt when the National Film School was set up. It may have been late in the day, but it was interesting that the person that they hired to run it and set it up, Colin Young, had already developed quite a formidable reputation as a charismatic and far-sighted educationalist at UCLA, where he had kind of risen through the ranks. He'd actually been a postgraduate student there, had ended up staying on and becoming an instructor, and had risen up the ranks to become chair of the School of Theatre Arts. And, you know, and there he'd been responsible for teaching a generation that included people like Francis Coppola, Paul Schrader, Haskell Wexler, and others. When he was persuaded to come back to the UK and set up Beaconsfield, here was someone who had a serious vision. He was also someone who, as well as kind of teaching, had been a great advocate for film culture. He was one of the people pressing for the setting up of an American Film Institute way back in the early 1960s. He also was a regular contributor to the journal Film Quarterly, and, you know, was someone who was very active in debates around the kind of role that film schools ought to be playing in the rejuvenation of Hollywood cinema. And remember, in the 1960s, before the emergence of the new Hollywood, Hollywood really was in a kind of bad place. It was running out of ideas. In fact, most of the Hollywood studios were spending as much time backing British-made productions as they were their own films back in Los Angeles at the time. So anyway, Colin comes into Beaconsfield in 1970. One of his first appointments is a young film editor called Roger Crittenden, who comes from the BBC. And Roger very quickly becomes Colin's deputy. And what they do is they set up a film school where the ethos is very much like the European national schools. The idea is that this school will attempt to transform British national cinema. It even had, if you like, a kind of an ethos. I mean, Colin was someone who had a very strong belief in the value of documentary. One of the things he'd done at UCLA was to set up a collaborative program with the anthropology department to make ethnographic films. And so the first 2 or 3 cohorts that came into Beaconsfield, there was a strong emphasis on them through the use of documentary engaging with their own culture. And in fact, part of that first generation, Nick Broomfield was one of the first cohort of students. Roger Deakins, the cinematographer, was another one. Mike Radford, the director, was another. So there was an attempt, if you like, to have, if not quite an ideology, certainly an orientation as to what British cinema apparently needed. Of course, we can debate about, 40 plus years on, how successful that kind of project has actually been. It's certainly been successful in other ways, but the point I'm trying to make here is that there was an intellectual kind of orientation. It wasn't just simply about training. And indeed, the curriculum that Colin set up at Beaconsfield was very interesting. It was a complete open sandpit. There was no structure. The students came in and basically could decide what they wanted to do. And they were pretty much left up to their own devices for 3 years. It was to change, and it was to change fairly rapidly, but it was, again, an incredibly interesting experiment at the time. More recently, I think one of the most inspiring and interesting and successful schools has been the National Film School of Denmark. It was set up in the 1960s. To begin with, it had an open sandpit type approach. But then in the mid-70s, a former cinematographer called Henning Kamera became the head. And along with his colleague Jorgen Leth here, who's an experimental filmmaker, they set about revising the curriculum and actually bringing in a very structured approach, an approach where the philosophy of kind of constraints and rules and limitations was imposed in order, as they saw it, to really liberate creativity. It took some time, but it proved to be incredibly successful. If you remember the whole Dogma 95 manifesto and that idea of a rules-based approach to filmmaking, this is something that comes directly out of the National Film School of Denmark. Lars von Trier's career has been a series, if you like, of kind of rules-based experiments. I mean, if any of you can remember von Trier's very early features, things like Element of Crime, Europa, these are films that are incredibly formal, incredibly slick. Everything is kind of absolutely perfect. They move very slowly, and then he decided to throw that away and start to have an approach where basically the camera was never on sticks. It was judding around all over the place. The edits were raw. The acting was very different. And in fact, it was Breaking the Waves was the first film I saw where it just seemed like this is made by a completely different filmmaker. If you think about, you know, films like Dogville, even some of his more kind of recent provocations, things like Antichrist or Melancholia, or even his latest film. I mean, on one level, what's interesting about von Trier is that he's setting himself new kind of formal challenges to work within certain rules. This all comes out of the intellectual approach of the National Film School of Denmark. The other thing that they set out to try and forge at the school was very much a collaborative way of working. And what's significant about a small country like Denmark is just how mutually supportive the filmmakers are. I think it's been one of the reasons why they've been so successful. They've also managed to persuade the government to spend lots of money on films, which has helped kind of maintain a level of output, which of course has been very successful, television as well as feature films. But so much of it goes back to the way in which the curriculum was rethought at the film school. So another example. But it isn't just in Europe. There's been an intellectual approach in the US. Now, if we take USC, which in many ways seems to be the kind of the industry school par excellence, when it was set up in 1932, in fact, the first thing to happen was a single course set up in 1929, which was a collaboration between USC and the then very young Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And this early course, which was an introduction to the photoplay, it was called, basically was taught by a number of Hollywood professionals, people like William DeMille, William Cameron Menzies, a whole range of kind of practitioners came in and gave classes. So the aspiration was to have something very industry focused. As I said earlier, it didn't happen for a long, long time. Now, one of the most important people who was at USC for a while was this guy here, Slavko Vorkapic, who was, I think, a Yugoslav, who ended up in the US in the 1920s, made an avant-garde film with Greg Toland in the 1920s, then became a specialist at montage sequences. If you ever see a kind of classic Hollywood film made in the 1930s or 1940s, including a number of Capras films, where there's a kind of a montage sequence that basically kind of takes you from one bit of the narrative to another, Vorkapic was your man. So he became an absolute specialist in this. Of course, he never lost his avant-garde edge. And he also kind of wrote about film form. And he became the leading light for a short but significant period at USC in the late 1940s. He had a number of acolytes who, were the sort of people who testified to his approach. People like the great Oscar-winning cinematographer Conrad Hall, whose films included Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a number of other kind of new Hollywood films, and then he had a second kind of phased his career from American Beauty onwards, where Sam Mendes kind of picked him out. The animator, is this working? Hang on, have I lost my red dot? Art Clokey was another student of Vorkapic's, so he became an important kind of animator. Saul Bass, the great titles designer, was another acolyte of Vorkapich. And I'm having a sort of senior moment here. Don Siegel, the director, was another one. So what you've got, again, within what we think of as a very commercial industry, an intellectual whose real focus was, a la Eisenstein, film form and the way in which, kind of film form creates a particular kind of language, becomes this great inspirational figure across a number of different kinds of areas, from cinematography to directing to, title designs to animation. So an absolute key figure there too. If we take NYU, another kind of largely unsung hero, Haig Manoogian, funnily enough, another European emigre, someone who was probably best known as Martin Scorsese's tutor at NYU in the 1960s. And in fact, Scorsese's debut feature film, Who's That Knocking at My Door, was produced by Manoogian. Manoogian also sort of presided over a generation that included people like Jim McBride and Kit Carson, who made a celebrated film called David Holzman's Diary, which is very much a kind of New York version of the Nouvelle Vague, about a kind of a film student, basically. But that, again, that kind of creation of an intellectually driven place, a place where obviously there's a different kind of local infrastructure in New York than there was in Los Angeles, was more open to a kind of independent innovation. And of course, I've put an image up there of Spike Lee's graduation film, the one about the barber shop, which both Spike Lee wrote and directed it. Ernest Dickerson was the cinematographer, and a young Ang Lee worked on it in an assistant capacity as well. So again, the way in which film schools were providing places for cohorts of people to come together to kind of develop, if you like, a community of kind of filmmaking. And what's interesting is the number of relationships, of creative relationships that were established, not just at the European schools, but also at the key American ones as well. And indeed, although we tend to talk about the leading lights being Coppola, Scorsese, and Lucas, for Coppola from UCLA, Scorsese from NYU, Lucas from USC, actually they were just part of a much wider kind of community of aspiring filmmakers, many of whom went on to kind of work actually closely with these figures. But I guess the auteur, the influence of the auteur theory, in fact, people like Manoogian actually were kind of quite keen on this. And Andrew Saris, who translated the Politique des auteurs for an American audience, really, and turned it into something called the auteur theory, also for a while taught at NYU during this period. Okay, so here's the movie Brats that I was sort of just mentioning. Just really to say here that a number of their kind of breakthrough films were made under the auspices of the film schools they were at. George Lucas's short film, THX 1138, Electronic Labyrinth, provided the basis for the subsequent feature film of the same name. Coppola's You're a Big Boy Now. He actually made his first feature film, Dementia 13, I think it was, for and again, I'm having a senior moment here, my goodness, Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, lots of them. Roger Corman. Roger Corman provided, if you like, a bridge for a lot of this generation to get into Hollywood. But so Coppola had actually made a film for Corman before he then made his master's project into a feature film. But again, it was this importance of the film school providing, if you like, that serious leg up, which would help these aspiring filmmakers. Now, things do start to change, however, once we get past that high watermark of auteurism. It was an interesting experiment, but clearly, just as Colin Young and co found at the National Film School, the industry started to get a little bit kind of wary of what's a course that seemed to be producing nothing but writer-directors. And there was a desire to try and, if you like, influence the way that teaching in film schools was developing in order to, I suppose, better serve what the industry thought its needs were. And so we begin to see an industrial turn happening, the roots of which actually are quite early in some places, but fundamentally it's about placing a new emphasis on screenwriting and producing, following basically the idea that everything depends on a good script, that a good script's going to actually sort of attract money, so you need to have the ability to develop scripts in an effective and appropriate way. Also, you need to train producers. The thing about the old national film schools, particularly the ones in Eastern Europe, is if you have a nationalised film industry, what does a producer do? The money's there, you know. It's not like you're working in a kind of an independent production type economy. But of course, the need for producers as, if you like, creative entrepreneurs developed, not just in the United States, various other places. So we begin to see new screenwriting courses emerging. But there's a link with Europe, because one of the key people here is this guy, Frank Daniel. Frank Daniel was a graduate of FAMU in Prague. He then taught screenwriting at Prague, but was part of that generation that left after the clampdown in 1968. He became one of the leading lights at the American Film Institute's school, subsequently went to Columbia where he taught screenwriting, and then to USC. Another key person was a guy called William Frug, who was a television writer, an Emmy award-winning television writer who developed screenwriting at UCLA. Back in Europe, this guy, Mogens Rukov, was the guy who was charged by Henning Kamera to develop screenwriting at the National Film School of Denmark. And again, I think, you know, we can see the way in which that helped to kind of, you know, develop this, you know, small national cinema featuring a language that only 5 million people in the world speak. On the production side, one of the first institutions to really kind of motor on that was USC, funnily enough. The producer Ray Stark, this guy here with John Huston, Ray Stark endowed a chair at USC, which actually then kicked off a producing program, which has had an incredible sort of success rate in developing, you know, kind of successful producers for Hollywood and American television. So this is something that that really starts to kind of develop and move us along from the idea of the filmmaker, of the auteur. We also get... yep.
Sorry to interrupt. Can we just leave a bit of time for some questions?
Sorry, am I? Yes, I'm getting quite close to the end. Sorry about that. Okay, so the triangle system is basically something that's been adopted in a number of film schools to really find ways of helping writers, directors and producers work together and develop, if you like, in collaboration. So we're getting back to a different version of the team. We've also got changing curricula. Just basically what we've got here is at both the National Film Television School and the Royal College, we've seen a significant change away from, if you like, a filmmaker-centered model, which is about auteurism, to a much more structured model that has led to a greater emphasis on specialization. These are just some of the sort of individuals concerned, but we can come back and say more about that if you like. But the point I wanted to make is that while it seems like we have gone down a particular line where the industry has started to call the shots more, where specialization has replaced auteurism, if we can put it kind of crudely like that, but actually specialism and innovation have gone hand in hand for a long time. At Vigeek, back in the interwar years, we already had kind of departments, some of them here, which were training people in very specialist areas. Similarly at EDEC, after the Second World War, we had these different departments. The Danish Film School was very much kind of set up and developed along the lines of the specialization was absolutely crucial. It was how you articulate, if you like, the collaboration between different specialists that was crucial, but specialization itself needn't necessarily create an instrumentalized approach. I wanted to say that at the London Film School, that the one thing that's marked there is that you've had pretty much a similar approach to the curriculum over nearly 50 years, where they still train all-round filmmakers, and they train them in a way where they work them through 6 different assigned exercises over a 2-year period. So they make 6 different films that have a set of different kinds of constraints and parameters. And then finally, some of the challenges that I wanted to kind of foreground here that come out of, I suppose, considering the history of film education and film schools is how do we resist a simple instrumentalization that seems to be what the skills training paradigm is providing? How do we create critical practitioners, people who have got the skills, who clearly, want to work in the industry, they don't want to work against it or alienate it, but can go in and have, if you like, a critical understanding of what's going on. How we can help our students understand how technical decisions, creative decisions, and also moral and even political decisions function together in the creation of meaning. The idea that, that behind every kind of creative decision there are a whole set of implications, the sort of thing that you would never find anywhere in a skill set document. And an awareness of difference that takes on board what globalization has actually meant, particularly when seen from below rather than above. This is something that in our book, Rod Stoneman, who has quite strong connections still with institutions in North Africa and in the Middle East, is very interested in the way in which digital technology is being used in very different ways in some of these countries and actually means something different to the way in which I think in Britain we already get really rather excited about, what digital technology can do, but in a kind of high-end way. We were talking earlier about, have you got a Red Epic, or can you actually afford to get an Arri Alexa? I mean, this is meaningless in the Maghreb, but what is very meaningful is that people are able to kind of use digital technology not only to make stuff, but to get it seen, to get it out there. And it's important that this gets built in some ways too. So I'm sorry if I've rabbited on a little bit too much, but thanks for listening. And yes, by all means, let's have a discussion. Thanks.
Come on, I can see one.
Forgive me that I arrived slightly late.
Bring you a drink.
So I missed the first bit, and maybe there were some. Are there any women in this story?
Very few, actually. And that's a very good point. Yes, so it's something that I guess I should acknowledge much more sort of. I mean, where we have finally got some women, but it's very late in the day, is that we now have a situation where the current deans of USC and UCLA are women. In terms of the European setup, Very few in the kinds of roles that I've been looking at. I mean, obviously what you can find, and certainly one of the things I've tried to highlight in the book, is that once you get to the 70s, you're starting to see in both continental Europe and in North America more female graduates, obviously, of film schools, because in the early days it's largely a boys' club there too. But it is interesting, and in fact one of the readers of the manuscript brought the issue up, and so what I did was to actually, if you like, make it explicit in more than one place. Well, you know, appropriate places, that this really was a very, very sort of male-dominated history.
Yes, and you can't manufacture what isn't there, but I think thinking about going forward, you know, if we're talking about the importance of creating meaning,
Yeah.
it's got to be a more democratic or more inclusive, so it's not just women, but
Yeah.
lots of other
Because actually what you have
marginalised groups.
What you have had is, well, in certain film schools, in relation to, say, the developing bits of the developing world, you've had some interesting connections that, you know, some of the leading lights of African cinema were trained at either the Soviet school or the French film school. Obviously, Latin American cinema is interesting because the institution that's been the most significant one there was the film school in Cuba, which was actually set up as, if you like, a pan-Latin American institution, really. It's kind of interesting that this little island that's almost at the United States would be the beacon for an entire continent going south from that point. So in terms of, if you like, you know, that level of inclusiveness, there's been some quite interesting developments, but no, the gender one is quite shocking.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, you know, because in the most recent BFI statistical yearbook, the statistics in that are absolutely shocking, with the underrepresentation of not just women but a whole range of minority groups. Well, women aren't minority groups, but a whole range of other minority groups, say. But I've been doing some research on contemporary film and television companies, and I've been really pleasantly surprised by the number of women that have really high-profile roles as producers in the television industry. So there's heaps of companies that have women that are either the founders or certainly working in senior management roles. So I wonder how that's come about and why there is such kind of an imbalance, if you like. Because I really wasn't expecting to find so many women in that. I wonder if you've come across any reasons for that, or if I don't know, perhaps they haven't arrived there through the film and television training program.
Well, I think certainly going back, you know, if you go back in time, I mean, the reasons are probably very obvious. That, you know, it was kind of seen as a bit of a boys' club, probably. I mean, there are kind of some examples that sort of pop up. So, you know, you will see some sort of women filmmakers coming through at, say, the Czech school or occasionally the Polish school. But in terms of the people who are, if you like, really calling the shots, they've mainly been guys. And as I say, until very, very recently. So there's another kind of story to be written here. I mean, there probably are like unsung kind of, you know, like you'll find in many, many other areas where once an area sort of opened up, then the next kind of challenge is how do you then get beyond, if you like, what seems like the official version of the history to what's then, you know, who didn't get the recognition but actually was the, you know.
I mean, maybe that's one of the reasons why so many women have ended up in producer roles, like Tessa Ross at Channel 4, for instance. So and maybe that's because there has been a kind of closed shop. I
mean, Linda Miles is head of fiction now at the National Film and Television School. But you know, the other kind of heads that I can think of, I mean, there have been heads of both design and, funnily enough, editing. Annabelle Pangborn was until very recently the sort of, you know, the head of the editing department, which kind of took in music and editing. So there are, you know, there are traces, but in terms of representation, it's yeah, fairly out of whack.
So that's primarily a study of film schools, but the training of moving images in all countries has come about through a set of other behaviours besides. I mean, if you were in an art school in the 60s and you wanted to take up film, making, film destroying, film ripping, film tearing, film scratching, then there were a set of other reasons why training as such was developed in different areas. Media courses that were platform. I mean, what's your take on the rest of the picture? Because that's a particular.
Well, I mean, there's obviously been periods when, even in relation to what the industry thought it wanted, or the institutions that were then influential on what then got made and had a profile. I mean, I'm thinking in particular, there's a chapter in the book on the Royal College. And the Royal College is an interesting institution because when it starts film and television production training, it's very much, you know, kind of geared towards the emergence of an advertising industry. So, you know, you get that first generation of people like Ridley and Tony Scott, for example. But in the 1970s under Stuart Hood, it became a centre of experimentalism, avant-gardism, political activism, and became the seedbed of what became, you know, big swathes of British independent film from about 1975 till, well, really the end of the 90s. And so many of, you know, that generation of independent practitioners came through the Royal College, being taught by a mixture of people. Peter Goodall was there at the time doing his structuralist stuff. Steve Dwoskin was there. Noel Birch was teaching there at the time. And also what Stuart Hood liked to do was to promote the seminar room as being one of the most important and creative fora in the whole, you know, programme. So seminars were as important as actually going out with kit and shooting stuff. And so it produced a much more, kind of varied group of people. And actually there was obviously some, you know, quite a significant number of women came through that, when I think about it. You know, people like Jan Worth, who was it that directed Song of the Shirt? Sue Clayton. Judith Williamson came through that programme, but then obviously went off to become a cultural studies academic. So that was less of a sort of a boys' club. The thing that created a lot of problems, though, and in fact ended up, you know, paving the way for Stuart Hood's departure, was that it was a time of, there's a kind of delayed reaction in terms of student activism. So the Royal College in the 70s was a place where, you know, seminars were continually being disrupted by student activism in politics, and what it did is it undermined the role of Stuart Hood, who was actually for all of this, but it seriously weakened him in terms of his relationship with the powers that be. And of course, because it was a film programme, it was expensive to run, and it did actually then lead to his departure. So they did themselves no favours in some respect in terms of, you know, the fact that it was all about argy-bargy. On the other hand, it did provide a much more pluralistic moving image culture, which fed into, you know, everything from the sort of workshop sector to those kind of swathes of films that, you know, the 11th Hour, and in fact Rod Stoneman and Alan Fountain's department used to kind of thrive on. Caroline Spry, who worked in that department too, was another graduate of the RCA in that time. So that was that was different. But going back to your question, Terry, I mean, what's interesting is it seemed to me that that was a significant part of what we thought of British cinema, what British cinema was in the 1980s, say. Because also it had institutional funding through Channel 4. The BFI was still providing money for, you know, the workshops at that point. So it was kind of like the industry. And it's that way of thinking that the industry definitely seemed to be more pluralistic, or certainly pluralistic in terms of the structures and what that produced. I mean, I guess nowadays it's possible to make work in lots of different contexts, get it kind of distributed and exhibited in different ways that can bypass what seems like a more homogenous industry. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I know there's a lot of people out there with great ideas who can get work out, you know, out there too, but is it being seen by sufficient numbers of people for it to really work or not? I'm not sure.
So, have you anything to say about the world of the post-apocalypse? The post-funded mode of placing finances right now. I'm not sure what we're doing. When you come to, no, I'm speaking for myself, of course.
No, I was wondering whether I've missed an apocalypse.
The apocalypse is the kind of what to do after the internet comes thrashing in, and there are many platforms of dissemination with potential questions like, are there enough people watching? It's not one person enough. I don't know. I mean, what do you come to with the book? What do you summate? What do you come to?
Well, I mean, I guess what the main reason for doing it was to try and get people to at least kind of take on board what the history has been, in order to see that there are potentially other ways of looking at things than certainly if you think about the major sort of institutional approach and the major sort of policy directions that have been going in around the role that people who are educating, you know, the next generation of practitioners have had to kind of try and sort of take up. And I suppose, you know, it's on one hand it's a kind of a modest sort of desire to just at least try and bring other considerations to the table to see if any of them kind of help to kind of create new ways of thinking. It may very well be that the terms are so strongly set now in a certain kind of way that it's hard to resist. On the other hand, you know, I know that there's a certain amount of dissatisfaction with the way in which skill set has been operating, and I know that there's a number of institutions now are kind of wondering whether they really, you know, having the tick, is it really that essential, especially if they're fleecing you for quite a lot of money when you come to your renewal sort of stage. Where that's going to go, we shall see. But I guess it's like a lot of things in higher education now, that the pressures are there to ensure that you're kind of you've got the right kind of kudos in terms of you know, are we appropriately, you know, vocationally and industry focused? On the other hand, are we ensuring that our student satisfaction levels remain high, despite the fact that the one thing I'm discovering is that I think if we had satisfied students, we wouldn't be doing our job properly. And what I mean by that is that they you know, it's a tough program we give them, and it's whether or not they're really then able to survive out there. And it is a bit of an assault course, and that doesn't make them comfortable. And the departments that seem to get the best rating, certainly at York, I think the departments where student comfort is a key issue. And I you know, I mean, I always thought a kind of creative environment was one where dissatisfaction was more likely to be the name of the game, because, you know, if you're satisfied, you're going to stop pushing yourself forward. I mean, I'm being slightly glib, but on the other hand, I'm not, because it is a problem. I want them to be happy after they're finished, not while they're going through it. So.
Maybe that's a really appropriate moment. Thanks. Your authoritative take across the last century and up to now. So thanks to Duncan Petrie.
Okay, well, thank you.